For years, the story has been pretty consistent. India, the world's fifth largest economy, and on a steady upward climb. But a recent headline just flipped the script, and honestly, it's causing a bit of a shock. So let's break down what's really going on here.
So the big question is, what happened? If you're feeling a bit of whiplash, you are definitely not alone. Weren't we on a one-way ticket up the ranks? Well, according to the very latest data from the IMF, that journey has just hit a pretty unexpected bump in the road. All right, first up, let's just tackle this surprising setback head-on. It's a development that seems to have put a bit of a delay on some of India's biggest economic ambitions, and it's certainly raising a lot of questions. And here it is, the core fact from the newest IMF projections. India has, for the moment, slipped back into the sixth position. Now, what that means is that those really ambitious goals of hitting fourth and then third place, they've been pushed back by about a year or two. So is this a real problem, or is it just a temporary blip?
To really get our heads around this, we need to decode how these rankings even work. It really all comes down to two totally different ways of measuring an economy. And believe me, the difference between them is everything in this story.
So, the ranking that always makes the news, it's based on something called nominal GDP. It's actually a pretty straightforward idea. You take the total value of everything a country produces in its own currency, so for India, that's rupees, and then you convert it all into US dollars. That's what lets you compare apples to apples with other countries. And here you can see the two side by side. On the left, you've got that nominal GDP. But on the right, there's another way to look at it called purchasing power parity, or PPP. Now this one tries to give you a truer sense of an economy by adjusting for how much things actually cost in that country. Think of it like this. Your money buys you way more coffee in Mumbai than it does in New York, right? PPP accounts for that. But for those big headline rankings, nominal GDP is the one everyone uses. And this is absolutely crucial. If we look at the PPP measurement, India's rank hasn't changed one bit. It is still the world's third largest economy. So this whole story about slipping to sixth, yeah, that is happening entirely inside that nominal GDP calculation. All right, so if the actual economic engine didn't suddenly stall, what on earth caused the drop in that nominal ranking? Well, the answer isn't really about factories or services. It's almost entirely about the wild, fluctuating world of currency exchange rates. Now, there are a few things going on here, but the single biggest reason, by far, is the major weakening of the Indian rupee. Of course, you've also got the US dollar getting stronger, some technical revisions in how India calculates its own GDP, and, a tougher economic climate around the world. So here's how that works. When things get a little shaky around the world, investors tend to rush to what they see as a safe haven, and more often than not, that's the US dollar. All that demand makes the dollar stronger, and when the dollar gets stronger, other currencies, like the rupee, get weaker in comparison. Let's just walk through this simple math. First, India's economy is measured in trillions of rupees. That's a huge number. But to get that international rank, you have to convert it to dollars. Now, if the rupee gets weaker, it takes more rupees to equal $1. So when you do that final conversion, the total dollar value of the GDP just looks smaller. And that causes the rank to slip, even if the economy is still growing just fine in its own currency. But it is absolutely essential to understand that this is seen as a short-term issue. If we stop looking at the snapshot and zoom out to the bigger picture, the long-term growth story for India is still very, very much on track. This timeline really puts it all into perspective. So yes, after being ahead for 3 years, the projection shows India slipping behind the UK for just a couple of years. But look what happens right after that. By 2027, the forecast shows India blowing past both the UK and Japan, and the big one, by 2031, the projection is to surpass Germany and become the world's third largest economy. So why is everyone so confident in that long-term forecast? Well, it really just boils down to speed. India's economy is expanding at a really solid 6 to 7% every year. Compare that to developed economies like Germany and Japan, which are growing at, maybe 1%. Over time, that massive difference in growth is like a rocket engine propelling India up the ranks. Okay, for our last section, let's step beyond the headline rank for a minute and look at the real, on-the-ground strengths and also some of the very real challenges that the Indian economy is still grappling with. One of India's biggest strengths is its own massive domestic market. A huge chunk, we're talking 55 to 60% of its entire GDP, is just driven by its own citizens buying things. This makes the economy incredibly resilient. It's less vulnerable to global trade problems compared to countries that depend on selling their stuff overseas.
But at the same time, you have to be realistic about the serious hurdles that are still there. Per capita income is still quite low, which puts India in the lower middle income category. Creating enough jobs for a huge young population is a monumental task. And then you have big issues like inequality, dependence on imported oil, and the constant need to improve education and healthcare.
So, on one hand, you have this absolutely massive, nearly $4 trillion economy. I mean, it's just a colossal number. But what happens when you take that colossal number and you have to divide it among 1.4 billion people? Well, when you do that, the income per person tells a very different story. It really shines a light on the gap between the nation's total wealth and the average person's wallet.
And that really brings us to the key takeaway here. A headline rank is a useful snapshot, for sure, but it is limited. It just doesn't capture the full picture of an economy's real strength, or even more importantly, the actual well-being of its people. Which leaves us with one final question to really think about. What actually defines economic success? Is it just a number on a global leaderboard, or is it the real, tangible prosperity and opportunity that's available to every single citizen? It's something worth thinking about. Thanks for joining this explainer.